The church bells of St. Anne's tolled 6 times through the morning fog, their bronze voices carrying over the slate rooftops of Manchester, that great cottonopolis of the north, though today our tale concerns not cotton, but paper, that humble servant of commerce and communication upon which the empire's business was conducted. The year was 1873, a time when the city's 100-mill chimneys already stood like ancient obelisks against the pearl-gray sky, each one breathing out its daily offering of smoke to the industrial gods of progress. Thomas Whitworth stirred in his narrow bed, the horsehair mattress crackling beneath him like autumn leaves. The familiar sounds of ancoats awakening filtered through the thin walls of his lodging house, the scrape of hobnailed boots on cobblestones, the distant whistle of the early freight train on the Lancashire and Yorkshire line, the cough of Mrs. Grimshaw next door as she stoked her fire for the morning's porridge. These were the symphonies of the industrial age, as regular and reliable as the movement of the planets themselves. Thomas's fingers, stained permanently with ink from 20 years of ledger work, fumbled for the pewter basin on his washstand. The water from last night had developed a thin skin of ice, which he broke with gentle taps, mindful not to wake the other lodgers. The cold water shocked his face into wakefulness as he performed his morning ablutions with the methodical precision of long habit. First, the face, always the face, scrubbed with a rough flannel cloth and a sliver of Wright's coal tar soap, that marvel of modern hygiene that promised to ward off the infectious miasmas that plagued the industrial districts. The soap's sharp, medicinal scent filled his small room, mixing with the ever-present smell of coal smoke that seeped through every crack and crevice of the building. Thomas had read in the Lancet, borrowed from the Mechanics' Institute library, that carbolic acid, derived from coal tar, possessed remarkable antiseptic properties. Dr. Joseph Lister himself had written extensively on the subject, though Thomas suspected that few of his fellow workers at Millbrook Paper Works had heard of the good doctor's theories about invisible germs. As he dressed in his second-best suit, the first being reserved for Sundays and society meetings, Thomas reflected on the day ahead. As treasurer of the Millbrook Paper Workers Mutual Aid and Benefit Society, he carried the weight of 300 families' security in his careful calculations. Each penny contributed, each payment disbursed, each medical claim verified, all must be recorded in his neat copperplate hand, balanced to the farthing. The suit itself told a story of careful economy and respectable poverty. The wool, though worn thin at the elbows, had been carefully darned by Mrs. Grimshaw in exchange for Thomas helping her son with his arithmetic. The collar, detachable and made of celluloid rather than linen, could be wiped clean each evening with a damp cloth, a great savings in laundry costs. His boots, purchased second-hand from Smithfield Market but lovingly maintained with blacking and dubbin, would last another winter if he was careful to avoid the worst of the puddles. Breakfast was a simple affair, a heel of yesterday's brown bread, toasted over his small fire and spread with drippings saved from Sunday's rare portion of meat. He drank his tea black and bitter, having learned to forego both milk and sugar as unnecessary luxuries. While he ate, he reviewed his memorandum book, running through the figures he would need to present at tonight's society meeting. The society itself was a marvel of working-class organization and self-help. For 4 pence a week, the price of a pint of porter, a man could secure for himself and his family a measure of protection against the vicissitudes of industrial life. Sickness benefit of 10 shillings weekly for up to 6 months. Funeral money of £3 10 shillings, enough for a respectable burial that would spare a widow the shame of a pauper's grave. access to the society's appointed physician, Dr. Hartwell, who attended members for a reduced fee. Even arrangements with Morrison's dental rooms on Oldham Street for emergency extractions at half the usual rate. Thomas closed his memorandum book and prepared to leave for the mill. He wrapped a woolen muffler around his throat, a gift from the society members last Christmas in recognition of his services, and checked that his door was secure. The streets were already filling with workers making their way to the mills and factories, their clogs creating a rhythmic percussion on the cobblestones that echoed off the soot-blackened brick walls. The walk to Millbrook Paper Works took him along the Rochdale Canal, where narrow boats laden with raw materials, esparto grass from Spain, old rags and waste paper for pulping, chemicals for bleaching, moved slowly through the murky water. The bargemen called out greetings, their breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. Thomas nodded in acknowledgement but didn't stop to chat. Punctuality was more than a virtue in the mills, it was a necessity. The machines waited for no man, and wages were docked for every minute of lateness. As he walked, Thomas observed the city awakening around him. The public houses, closed since 11 the previous night under the new licensing laws, stood dark and silent. But the coffee houses and temperance cafes were already serving hot drinks and simple breakfasts to workers who could afford them. The smell of roasting coffee beans from Hardcastle's coffee rooms competed with the acrid smoke from the chimneys, creating an oddly pleasant mixture that Thomas had come to associate with morning. He passed the public wash house on every street, where already a queue of women waited with their bundles of laundry. The wash house, built just 5 years previous through public subscription and municipal bonds, was one of the great improvements of the age. For tuppence, a family could have access to hot water, washing coppers, mangles, and drying rooms, luxuries impossible in the cramped courts and cellars where so many workers lived. Thomas remembered the old days, before the wash houses, when Monday was universally dreaded as washing day. The single room that served as home to an entire family would be transformed into a steam-filled chaos of wet clothing, soap suds, and frayed tempers. Children would be sent to play in the streets regardless of weather, while mothers labored over zinc tubs with water heated in kettles over the fire. The lucky ones might share a copper in the court, but this meant rising at 4 in the morning to claim one's turn. Now, the municipal washhouses provided not just convenience but hygiene. The corporation's medical officer, Dr. Lee, had published statistics showing a marked decrease in typhoid and scarlet fever in districts served by public washhouses. Clean clothing, regularly washed in truly hot water with proper soap, formed a barrier against disease, though Thomas knew many of his fellow workers remained skeptical of such newfangled notions. Millbrook Paper Works rose before him like a great brick cathedral of industry, its central chimney stretching 200 feet into the gray morning sky. The sound hit him first, the rhythmic thundering of the great paper machines, the hiss of steam, the clatter of the rag-cutting engines, all blending into that peculiar symphony that was the heartbeat of industrial production. The smell came next, the sharp chemical tang of chlorine bleach, the sweet-sour scent of fermenting wood pulp, the omnipresent coal smoke, and underneath it all, the distinctive smell of wet paper and sizing compounds. Thomas entered through the workers' gate, nodding to old Samuel, the gatekeeper, whose responsibility it was to ensure no one entered the works while intoxicated and to prevent the theft of materials. Samuel's little booth, heated by a small coal stove, contained a timekeeping clock where workers inserted their numbered checks to record their arrival. Thomas had his own check, number 247, worn smooth by 20 years of daily handling. The mill yard was already busy with activity. Carts loaded with bales of rags waited to be unloaded at the sorting sheds. The rag sorters, mostly women and children, would spend their days separating the materials by color and quality, removing buttons and other hard objects that might damage the machinery. It was considered light work, suitable for females, though Thomas knew the reality was different. The dust from the rags, laden with all manner of dirt and disease from their previous lives as clothing and household linens, made respiratory complaints common among the sorters. The society had recently voted to extend membership to the female workers, a controversial decision that had required 3 separate meetings to resolve. Thomas had argued forcefully in favor, pointing out that the women paid the same contributions as men and faced the same, if not greater, risks of injury and illness. The motion had finally passed by a margin of just 7 votes, and now 43 women were enrolled as members, entitled to the same benefits as their male counterparts. Thomas made his way to his small office adjacent to the counting house, where the mill's commercial transactions were recorded. As treasurer, he was granted this privilege by Mr. Millbrook himself, who viewed the Benefit Society as a useful institution that reduced the number of desperate requests for advances on wages and loans that had previously plagued the management. The office was barely 6 feet by 8, but it was Thomas's domain, containing his desk, a small safe for the Society's funds, and shelves lined with ledgers dating back to the Society's foundation in 1861. He lit the gas lamp, another luxury not afforded to the general workers who labored by natural light supplemented by tallow candles, and opened the current ledger. The pages were ruled with precision, each column designated for specific information: member's name and number, contributions paid, arrears, benefits claimed, amounts disbursed. The ink entries, in Thomas's careful hand, told stories of industrial life in their neat rows and columns. Here was William Hartley, number 133, who had claimed sickness benefit for 3 weeks after a vat of boiling size had overturned, scalding his legs. The society had paid out 30 shillings, plus 7 shillings and 6 pence to Dr. Hartwell for treatment. The doctor had applied Goulard's extract of lead, a sovereign remedy for burns, and prescribed laudanum for the pain. Hartley had returned to work last Monday, though Thomas had noted he still walked with a pronounced limp. There was Martha Greenwood, one of the new female members, who had claimed her lying-in benefit, 10 shillings paid upon the birth of a child, provided the member had contributed for at least 9 months prior. The Society's rules specified that a member must present a certificate from a qualified midwife or doctor confirming the birth. Mrs. Blackburn, the district midwife approved by the Society, had attended Martha and reported a difficult but successful delivery of a healthy male infant. The morning passed in careful calculation and correspondence. Thomas wrote to other benefit societies in the Manchester district, sharing information about members who had moved between mills, ensuring that no one attempted to claim benefits from multiple societies simultaneously, a fraud that had been attempted more than once. He also corresponded with the Prudential Assurance Company, which offered to underwrite additional death benefits for society members at reduced rates, though Thomas remained suspicious of their London ways and preference for profit over mutual aid. At 10 o'clock, he heard the steam whistle that announced the morning break. Workers had 15 minutes to consume whatever food they had brought in to attend to nature's necessities. Thomas knew that many used this time to visit the mill's water closets, another recent improvement that Mr. Millbrook had installed at considerable expense. Previously, workers had made do with earth closets in the yard, or worse, held their needs until the dinner break when they could return home. The water closets were a marvel of modern sanitation, though their maintenance was a constant source of complaint from the mill engineer. The system required a steady supply of water from the roof cisterns, and the pipes frequently froze in winter or became blocked with foreign matter that workers thoughtlessly disposed of in them. Still, they were infinitely preferable to the old arrangements, and the reduction in what the management delicately referred to as time lost to necessary purposes had more than justified the investment. Thomas used the break to walk through the mill, observing conditions, and speaking with workers about their concerns. The main paper hall was a cathedral of industry, with ceilings 30 feet high to accommodate the massive paper machines. The newest machine, installed just last year at a cost of £3,000, could produce a continuous sheet of paper 20 feet wide at a rate of 50 feet per minute. The noise was tremendous. Workers communicated primarily through gestures and lip reading, and many suffered from partial deafness after years of exposure. The heat and humidity were overwhelming. The paper-making process required vast quantities of steam and hot water, and the temperature in the machine halls regularly exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit even in winter. Workers stripped to their shirts and trousers, and even then were constantly drenched in perspiration. The society had successfully petitioned Mr. Millbrook to provide earthenware jars of clean drinking water, replenished twice daily, to prevent workers from drinking from the canal or the various processed water supplies that might be contaminated with chemicals. In the bleaching house, the conditions were different but equally challenging. Here, the air was thick with chlorine fumes that burned the throat and eyes. Workers had fashioned crude respirators from cotton waste soaked in water, but these provided only minimal protection. The society had investigated the possibility of purchasing proper respirators of the type used in chemical works, but the cost, 15 shillings each, was prohibitive. Instead, they had negotiated for workers in the bleaching house to receive an extra penny per day in unwholesome work allowance and to be rotated to other departments every 3 months. The dinner whistle at noon released a flood of workers into the yard and surrounding streets. Those who lived nearby hurried home for a hot meal, while others gathered in groups to eat whatever cold provisions they had brought. Thomas observed the various dinner arrangements with the eye of one who understood their social significance. The unmarried men often clubbed together to purchase hot pies from the vendors who appeared at the gates precisely at noon. The family men ate bread and cold bacon or cheese, wrapped in cloths by their wives before dawn. The poorest made do with bread and dripping, perhaps supplemented with a raw onion for flavor. Thomas returned to his office to eat his own modest meal while reviewing the correspondence from Dr. Hartwell regarding recent medical cases among society members. The doctor's report, written in the elaborate medical terminology of the age, required careful translation for the membership. The patient presents with phthisis of a pulmonary nature, evidenced by hemoptysis and progressive cachexia, meant simply that another worker was dying of consumption, that great scourge of the industrial districts that claimed more lives than all other diseases combined. Dr. Hartwell had strong opinions about the prevention of consumption, which he had shared with Thomas over many consultations. The disease, he believed, thrived in conditions of overcrowding, poor ventilation, and general debility. He recommended that workers sleep with windows open, a radical suggestion that most dismissed as a sure invitation to catch their death of cold. He also prescribed cod liver oil, beef tea, and regular applications of counterirritants to the chest, treatments that might slow the disease's progress but rarely cured it. The Society had recently voted to establish a convalescent fund, separate from the regular sickness benefit, to send members recovering from serious illness to the seaside for recuperation. The salt air and rest were believed to have remarkable restorative properties, particularly for lung complaints. Last month, they had sent young James Patterson, a machine tender suffering from mill fever, a form of bronchitis common among textile and paper workers, to Blackpool for a week. He had returned notably improved, though whether from the sea air or simply from the rest away from the mill's atmosphere was debatable. After dinner, Thomas attended to one of his regular duties, inspecting the lodgings of members claiming long-term sickness benefit. The Society's rules required that members receiving benefit for more than 2 weeks submit to home visits to verify their condition and circumstances. It was an unpleasant duty. No man enjoyed having his poverty inspected, but necessary to prevent malingering and ensure the Society's funds were properly used. His first visit was to Robert Clark, a machine operator who had suffered a compound fracture of the leg when caught in a drive belt. Thomas made his way through the narrow streets of Ancoats to Clark's lodging in a court off Jersey Street. The court itself was typical of workers' housing. A narrow passage between high brick walls led to a square courtyard surrounded by 3-story buildings. A single privy and ash pit served the 30 families who lived there, and the smell was overwhelming despite the cold weather. The Clark family occupied 2 rooms on the 2nd floor. Thomas climbed the worn wooden stairs, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. He knocked gently. Illness deserved quiet respect, and was admitted by Mrs. Clark, a thin woman whose face showed the strain of her husband's injury. The front room served as kitchen, parlor, and workspace where Mrs. Clark took in sewing to supplement the sickness benefit. The back room, Thomas knew without seeing, would contain the family's beds, one for the parents, another shared by their 3 children. Robert Clark lay on a horsehair sofa near the fire, his splinted leg elevated on a wooden box. The doctor had set the bone, but infection had set in. Thomas could smell the sweet sick odor of suppuration even through the carbolic dressings. Dr. Hartwell had prescribed poultices of linseed meal and frequent irrigation with carbolic solution, but Thomas could see from the empty medicine bottles on the mantelpiece that the family was struggling to afford the treatments. "How are you keeping, Robert?" Thomas asked, settling into the single wooden chair Mrs. Clark offered. "Bearing up, Mr. Whitworth, bearing up," Clark replied, though his gray face and trembling hands told a different story. "The doctor says another month before I can think about returning to work, if the bone knits properly." Thomas made notes in his memorandum book. The Society would continue the 10 shillings weekly benefit, and he would speak to Dr. Hartwell about extending credit for the necessary medicines. He also made a mental note to mention Clark's case at the next meeting. Perhaps a special collection could be taken up to help with additional expenses. Before leaving, he advised Mrs. Clark on matters of hygiene that might aid her husband's recovery. The windows, sealed with rags against drafts, should be open for at least an hour daily to allow fresh air to circulate. The carbolic solution should be diluted precisely according to the doctor's instructions. Too weak and it would not prevent infection, too strong and it might damage healthy tissue. The dressings should be boiled for 10 minutes before use and handled as little as possible. Mrs. Clark listened attentively, though Thomas suspected she had neither the time nor the facilities to follow all his suggestions. How could she boil dressings when every pot was needed for cooking and washing? How could she open windows when the children were already shivering under thin blankets? These were the cruel mathematics of poverty, choosing between competing necessities, each one vital, none fully achievable. The afternoon shift at Millbrook Paper Works began at 1:30, announced by the steam whistle that could be heard for miles around. Thomas returned to find a queue of workers waiting outside his office, each with some business relating to the society. First was Tom Bradshaw, a burly stoker from the boiler house, who wanted to increase his contributions to qualify for the higher level of funeral benefit. His wife was expecting their 7th child, and the pregnancy was not going well. "It's not that I'm expecting the worst, Mr. Whitworth," Bradshaw said, turning his cap nervously in his massive hands, "but a man must prepare for all eventualities. If something should happen to Sarah." Thomas understood. Childbirth remained dangerous despite all the advances of modern medicine. The society had paid out 3 maternity death benefits already this year. He explained that Bradshaw could increase his contributions to 6 pence weekly, which would qualify him for the £5 funeral benefit after 6 months of continuous payment. He also reminded him that the society had an arrangement with Mrs. Blackburn, the certified midwife, who would attend society members for a reduced fee of 5 shillings. "Has Sarah been taking the iron tonic Dr. Hartwell prescribed?" Thomas asked. The doctor was a great believer in iron preparations for pregnant women, claiming they prevented the exhaustion and hemorrhage that claimed so many lives. "When we can afford it," Bradshaw admitted. "It's 6 pence a bottle at the chemist's, and it don't last but a week." Thomas made another note. Perhaps the society could negotiate with Morrison's Pharmacy for a bulk purchase of common medicines at reduced rates. It was something to propose at the next committee meeting. Next came a delegation of young workers from the rag cutting room, led by Albert Henshaw, a bright lad of perhaps 20 who had been elected as their shop steward. They wanted to discuss the conditions in their department, particularly the lack of ventilation and the prevalence of what they called rag fever, or respiratory condition caused by inhaling the dust and fibers from the processed materials. "We've had 7 men off sick this month alone," Henshaw explained, consulting a piece of paper covered with penciled notes. "The dust is so thick some days you can't see across the room. We've asked Mr. Carmichael, the department supervisor, about installing ventilation fans like they have at the Britannia Mill, but he says the cost isn't justified." This was a familiar complaint, and one that touched on the fundamental tension between workers' health and industrial profit. Thomas knew that ventilation systems existed. He had read about them in the Mechanics magazine, but they were expensive to install and maintain. The fans themselves, powered by steam engines or water wheels, cost upwards of £50 each, and the ductwork required significant structural modifications to the building. "Have you tried the wet method?" Thomas suggested. "I've heard that some mills spray water mist into the air to keep the dust down." "We suggested that," Henshaw replied, "but Carmichael says it would damage the paper quality. The humidity, you see." Thomas promised to raise the issue with the Society's committee and perhaps arrange for a delegation to meet with Mr. Millbrook directly. Sometimes the owner, removed from day-to-day operations, could be more sympathetic than his supervisors, especially if the case was presented in terms of reducing sickness absences and maintaining productivity. After the delegation left, Thomas returned to his ledgers, but his concentration was interrupted by a commotion in the yard. Through his small window, he could see workers gathering around someone on the ground. He hurried outside to find Matthew Pearson, a young apprentice from the machine hall, writhing in agony with what appeared to be a dislocated shoulder. "Caught his sleeve in the calendar rollers," someone explained. "Lucky he weren't pulled right through." Thomas sent a boy running for Dr. Hartwell, whose surgery was only 3 streets away, and helped carry Pearson to the mill's first aid room, a recent addition that Thomas and the society had strongly advocated for. The room was simple: a wooden table that served as an examination bed, a cabinet containing basic medical supplies, and a chair for the patient or attendant. But it was clean, well-lit, and private, infinitely better than treating injuries on the mill floor surrounded by gawking workers and running machinery. While they waited for the doctor, Thomas did what he could to make Pearson comfortable. He loosened the boy's collar and gave him small sips of water mixed with a few drops of laudanum from the medical cabinet. The shoulder was grotesquely deformed, pushed forward and down from its normal position, and Pearson's face was gray with pain and shock. Dr. Hartwell arrived within 15 minutes, his black medical bag in hand, and his assistant, a young man studying medicine at Owens College, following behind. The doctor was a man of perhaps 50, with gray whiskers and the confident manner of one who had seen every type of industrial injury. "Anterior dislocation of the glenohumeral joint," he announced after a brief examination. "We'll need to reduce it immediately. Mr. Whitworth, if you and Mr. Jenkins would assist by holding the patient steady." What followed was a procedure both fascinating and disturbing. Dr. Hartwell first administered a larger dose of laudanum, enough to dull but not eliminate sensation. Complete unconsciousness with chloroform was reserved for major surgery. He then manipulated the arm using a technique he called the Coker method, rotating and lifting the limb in a specific sequence until, with an audible pop that made everyone wince, the joint returned to its proper position. Pearson's relief was immediate and profound. The doctor fashioned a sling from a triangular bandage and prescribed rest for at least 2 weeks, with daily applications of arnica for the bruising and inflammation. He would need to return to the surgery in 3 days for re-examination. "He's fortunate," Dr. Hartwell told Thomas privately as they left the first aid room. "I've seen men lose their arms in those rollers." The boy's quick reflexes saved him from much worse. This led to a discussion about mill safety that continued as they walked back to the doctor's surgery. Dr. Hartwell was preparing a report for the factory inspector on accidents at local mills, and he wanted Thomas's observations from the Benefit Society's records. "The pattern is clear," the doctor explained, showing Thomas's preliminary statistics. "Most accidents occur either in the first hour of the morning shift, when workers are still cold and stiff, or in the last hour of the evening shift, when exhaustion impairs judgment. And young workers like Pearson are disproportionately affected. They have the energy and foolishness to take risks that older workers wouldn't consider." As the afternoon wore on and the light began to fade from the grimy windows of the mill, Thomas prepared for the evening's society meeting. He gathered his ledgers, correspondence, and the agenda he had carefully prepared. Tonight's meeting would address several important matters: the proposal for bulk medicine purchases, the ventilation issue in the rad cutting room, and most controversially, a suggestion from some members to establish a dental fund. But first, Thomas would observe his weekly ritual of visiting the public baths on Corporation Street. It was an indulgence that cost threepence, sixpence if one wanted a private bathroom with hot water, but Thomas considered it essential for both health and respectability. A man who handled the society's money and met with doctors and officials needed to present himself properly. The walk to the baths took him through some of Manchester's more prosperous streets, where gas lamps were already being lit by the lamplighters making their rounds with their long poles. The shops here catered to the middle classes, drapers with plate glass windows displaying the latest fashions, bookshops with leather-bound volumes, chemists with colored bottles of patent medicines promising cures for every ailment known to man. The Victoria Baths, built 5 years ago through a combination of municipal funds and private subscription, was an imposing building of red brick with stone facings, designed in the Italian style that was fashionable for public buildings. The entrance hall, with its tiled floor and painted ceiling, spoke of civic pride and the improving spirit of the age. Thomas paid his threepence to the attendant, receiving in return a ticket, a rough towel, and a small piece of soap. The second-class baths, for that was what threepence bought you, consisted of a large room with 20 individual tubs arranged in rows. Each tub was made of zinc, with a wooden rim to prevent the metal from burning the bather, and could be filled with hot or cold water from taps connected to the building's elaborate boiler system. The bathing room was already busy with workers washing away the day's grime. The air was thick with steam and the smell of carbolic soap, coal tar, and wet wool. Men undressed with practiced efficiency, hanging their clothes on numbered hooks corresponding to their tub number. There was no false modesty here. Industrial work stripped away such pretensions along with the sweat and dirt. Thomas lowered himself into the hot water with a sigh of pleasure. The heat penetrated his aching muscles and joints, worn from years of hunching over ledgers and walking the hard mill floors. He scrubbed himself thoroughly with the carbolic soap, paying particular attention to his hands and nails. Clean fingernails were a mark of respectability that separated the careful working man from the careless laborer. Around him, he could hear the conversations of his fellow bathers. Two men discussed the latest parliamentary debate on the Factory Acts, wondering if the proposed reduction in working hours would ever come to pass. Another group debated the merits of various patent medicines. Was Holloway's pills truly superior to Beecham's, or was it all advertising puffery? One conversation particularly caught his attention. A man he recognized as a foreman from the Britannia cotton mill was describing a new system of disease prevention they had implemented on the advice of their medical officer. Every worker has to wash their hands with carbolic solution before eating, the foreman explained. And we've installed what they call antiseptic stations near the privies, basins with carbolic solution that must be used after attending to nature's calls. The doctor says it's cut our typhoid cases by half. Thomas made a mental note to investigate this further. The cost of carbolic acid had decreased significantly as production increased, making such measures more feasible for working-class institutions. After 20 minutes, the maximum time allowed for threepence, Thomas reluctantly left the bath. He dried himself with the rough towel, dressed in his clean shirt and collar that he had brought with him, and felt remarkably refreshed. The walk back to the Mechanics' Institute, where the society meeting would be held, took him past the night market where vendors sold hot food to workers heading home or to the night shift. He stopped briefly at a coffee stall, purchasing a cup of hot coffee and a piece of seed cake for tuppence. The coffee was bitter and probably stretched with chicory, but it was hot and warming. The cake, heavy with caraway seeds, would serve as his supper. The Mechanics' Institute on David Street stood as a monument to the self-improvement ethos of the industrial working class. Built through subscription and donation, it contained a library of 3,000 volumes, a lecture hall, several meeting rooms, and even a small museum of scientific instruments and geological specimens. The gas lamps in the entrance hall cast a warm glow on the portraits of local worthies, mill owners and reformers who had contributed to the institution's foundation. Thomas arrived early to prepare the meeting room. He arranged the chairs in rows facing the small platform where the committee would sit, set out the ledgers and papers on the secretary's table, and checked that the gas lights were all functioning properly. The room could hold 100 men comfortably, though typical attendance was closer to 60, those who took their responsibilities to the society seriously enough to sacrifice an evening's rest. By 7:30, members began arriving, their heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. They came in their best clothes, not their Sunday best, which would be ostentatious, but clean and respectable working attire. Many had washed and changed after their shift, understanding that the society meeting was a formal occasion deserving of proper presentation. The committee took their places on the platform. William Thornton, the president, a veteran spinner with 30 years' experience and the respect of all who knew him. James Crawford, the secretary, whose copperplate handwriting recorded the society's proceedings in minute books that were works of art in themselves. Thomas in his role as treasurer, and 4 committee members elected annually to represent different departments of the mill. President Thornton called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel, a wooden mallet presented to the society by the Carpenters' Union in solidarity. The men fell silent, removing their caps and settling into attitudes of attention. "Brothers," Thornton began, using the traditional address that emphasized the society's foundations in mutual aid and collective responsibility, "we gather once again in the spirit of fellowship and common purpose. Let us begin, as always, with the reading of our objects." Secretary Crawford stood and read from the Society's rule book in a clear, carrying voice. "The objects of the Millbrook Paper Workers Mutual Aid and Benefit Society shall be, first, to provide relief to members in times of sickness, accident, or infirmity. Second, to ensure decent burial for members and their immediate families. Third, to promote the moral, intellectual, and physical welfare of the working classes. Fourth, to encourage habits of prudence, temperance, and thrift among our membership." The reading of the objects was more than ritual, it was a reminder of the Society's purpose and principles, distinguishing it from a mere insurance scheme or savings club. This was about dignity, solidarity, and the radical notion that working men could manage their own affairs without the patronage of their betters. Thomas then presented his treasurer's report, standing to read from his carefully prepared statement. "Brothers, I am pleased to report that the Society's finances remain sound. Our current balance stands at £47, 6 shillings, and 4 pence. During the past month, we have received contributions totaling £12, 4 shillings, and have disbursed £9, 16 shillings in benefits. The breakdown is as follows: 5 members claimed sickness benefit for a total of 73 days, resulting in payments of £6, 10 shillings. 1 funeral benefit of £3, 10 shillings was paid for the burial of Brother Morrison's infant daughter. Medical attendance fees to Dr. Hartwell amounted to £2, 6 shillings. He continued with meticulous detail, knowing that transparency in financial matters was essential to maintaining the members' trust. Every penny was accounted for, every transaction explained. When he finished, several members asked questions about specific expenditures, which Thomas answered with reference to his ledgers. The meeting then moved to new business. Albert Henshaw, the young shop steward from the rag cutting room, stood to present his department's petition regarding ventilation. He spoke nervously at first but gained confidence as he described the conditions his colleagues endured daily. "The dust is so thick, brothers, that men are spitting black phlegm for hours after their shift ends. We've had more sick days in our department than any other, and it's not because we're shirkers, it's because we can barely breathe by the end of the day." An elderly worker named Patterson stood to support the petition. "I worked 40 years in the cotton mills before coming to paper," he said, his voice hoarse from decades of inhaling industrial air. "I've seen what dust does to a man's lungs. I'm 62 years old, but I was like a man of 80. We must do something for the younger men, so they don't end up like me." The discussion that followed was vigorous but orderly. Some members worried about antagonizing Mr. Millbrook by making demands. Others argued that the Society's purpose was precisely to advocate for such improvements. Thomas suggested forming a delegation to present the case in terms of economic benefit. Healthier workers meant fewer sick days and higher productivity. After much debate, a motion was passed to appoint a committee of 5, including Thomas and Henshaw, to prepare a formal proposal for ventilation improvements to present to management. The next item was Thomas's proposal for bulk medicine purchases. He explained how the Society could negotiate with Morrison's Pharmacy to buy common medicines, laudanum, carbolic acid, iron tonic, arnica, in quantity at reduced prices. These could then be dispensed to members at cost, saving them significant money on essential treatments. "Consider Brother Clark," Thomas said, referring to his earlier visit. "He needs carbolic solution for his dressings, but at 6 pence a bottle, it's a serious burden on his family while he's unable to work. If we could provide it for 3 pence, that savings could mean the difference between proper treatment and suffering." Dr. Hartwell, who attended Society meetings as an honorary member and medical advisor, stood to support the proposal. "Gentlemen, I see too many cases where recovery is delayed or complicated because patients cannot afford the full course of treatment. This scheme would literally save lives." The doctor then took the opportunity to deliver a short lecture on hygiene and disease prevention, a regular feature of Society meetings that combined education with entertainment. Tonight's topic was the proper treatment of wounds to prevent blood poisoning. "The old ways, spider webs, moldy bread, various poultices, are not just useless but dangerous," he explained. "Carbolic acid, properly diluted, kills the invisible organisms that cause putrefaction. Keep wounds clean, change dressings regularly, and seek medical attention at the first sign of red streaks or excessive swelling." The final item of new business proved the most controversial, the proposal to establish a dental fund. Brother Mitchell, a senior papermaker whose swollen jaw testified to his personal interest in the matter, presented the case. "Brothers, we provide for sickness and burial, but what about the daily agony that so many of us endure from rotten teeth? A man can't work properly when his mouth feels like it's on fire. And the cost of extraction, 1 shilling and 6 pence at Morrison's, even with our discount, is beyond many members when they're already struggling." The room stirred uneasily. Dental problems were universal among the working classes, but they were also seen as somehow different from other medical issues, more personal, more shameful, perhaps because they were so visible when a man smiled or spoke. Thomas had researched the subject in preparation for the discussion. He stood to present his findings. According to the Manchester Board of Health, dental disease is the third most common cause of work absence after respiratory ailments and injuries. The average working man loses 12 teeth by age 40, and many have none at all by 50. The new dental hospital on Grosvenor Street treats over 1,000 patients monthly, but the waiting lists stretch for weeks. He had visited Morrison's dental rooms to investigate their facilities and methods. The memory still made him shudder slightly. The surgery occupied the second floor of a building on Oldham Street, announced by a large sign depicting a gleaming white tooth. The waiting room had been packed with sufferers, some holding swollen jaws, others trying to hide their decay behind tight-lipped expressions. Mr. Morrison himself, a qualified dental surgeon who had trained in Edinburgh, had shown Thomas around. The operating room contained a mechanical dental chair, an American innovation that could be adjusted for height and reclined for better access to the patient's mouth. The foot-powered drill, another recent invention, stood in the corner like an instrument of medieval torture with its system of pulleys and flexible cables. For extraction, Morrison had explained, demonstrating with a set of fearsome-looking forceps, we still rely on speed and strength. The new cocaine preparations can numb the area, but they're expensive, 6p extra per application. Most workers choose to endure the brief agony rather than pay for relief. Morrison had shown him the drawer of extracted teeth, hundreds of them, sorted by type and condition. Many were so rotten they crumbled at a touch. Others showed the characteristic black decay of workers who chewed tobacco to dull chronic tooth pain. The real tragedy, Morrison had said, is that much of this is preventable. Regular cleaning with tooth powder, avoiding excess sugar, prompt treatment of cavities before they reach the nerve, these simple measures could save countless teeth. But workers only come when the pain is unbearable, by which time extraction is the only option. Back in the meeting, the debate over the dental fund continued. Some argued it would drain the society's resources for what they saw as a non-essential service. Others pointed out that a man who couldn't eat properly due to tooth pain would soon be unable to work at all. Brother Grimshaw, a boilerman known for his practical wisdom, offered a compromise. What if we start small? Set aside £1 monthly for emergency extractions only, when a man can't work due to tooth pain. See how it goes for 6 months, then review. This proposal found support, and after further discussion, it was put to a vote. The motion passed by a narrow margin, 32 in favor, 28 against, with several abstentions. As the meeting progressed, Thomas noticed several members discreetly using snuff or chewing tobacco, common practices for dull and chronic tooth pain. The statistics were sobering. The average worker consumed over a pound of tobacco yearly, much of it for self-medication rather than pleasure. Dr. Hartwell, asked for his medical opinion on dental health, provided a brief lecture that was both educational and slightly terrifying. Gentlemen, the mouth is the gateway to the body. Infected teeth can spread poison through the blood, affecting the heart, joints, and other organs. I've seen men die from blood poisoning that started with an abscessed tooth. The new science of bacteriology shows us that the mouth harbors countless microscopic organisms, some beneficial, others deadly when they enter the bloodstream. He recommended simple preventive measures: rinsing with salt water daily, cleaning teeth with a cloth dipped in chalk powder, avoiding the excessive consumption of treacle and sugar. "I know these things seem trivial," he said, "but they can add years to your life and save you considerable agony." The meeting concluded at 9:30 with the traditional singing of the workers' hymn, not a religious song but a secular anthem of solidarity and hope composed by a Lancashire weaver. The men's voices, rough from work and tobacco, harmonized surprisingly well. Brothers all, in toil united, standing firm though tempest tossed. By our labor, hope is lighted, no effort truly lost. Hand in hand we face tomorrow. Share the burden, ease the sorrow. In our unity find power. Brothers all, this is our hour. As the members filed out into the cold night, many stopped to shake Thomas's hand or ask quick questions about their contributions or benefits. He noted each query in his memorandum book, promising to investigate and respond at the next meeting or during his office hours at the mill. Walking home through the gaslit streets, Thomas reflected on the evening's proceedings. The society was doing good work, but the needs always seemed to outstrip the resources. For every member they helped, there were 10 non-members suffering without support. The challenge was not just financial but educational, convincing workers that sacrificing 4 pence weekly now could save them from destitution later. His route took him past the night shift workers heading to the mills. These men worked from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, tending the machines that never stopped, keeping the boilers fed, maintaining the endless cycle of production. Night work paid an extra penny per hour, but the cost to health and family life was considerable. Thomas knew many night workers who aged prematurely, their natural rhythms disrupted by sleeping during daylight. Their children learned to whisper during the day, their wives cooked dinner at breakfast time, their whole domestic existence inverted to accommodate the demands of industry. Reaching his lodging house, Thomas climbed the stairs quietly, mindful of his neighbors who rose at 4 for the early shift. His room was cold, the fire had died hours ago, but he was too tired to rekindle it. He lit a candle, saving gas for when he truly needed it, and prepared for bed. His evening ablutions were simpler than the mornings, washing his face and hands in the cold water from the pitcher, cleaning his teeth with a frayed willow twig and chalk powder, a final use of the chamber pot that he would empty in the morning. The carbolic soap from his bath earlier still lingered on his skin, a clean smell that would fade by tomorrow evening. Before retiring, Thomas spent a few minutes updating his personal journal, not a diary of feelings and observations, but a careful record of health-related information. Today's entry read: November 15th, 1873. Weather cold and damp, fog heavy and morning lifting by noon. Slight cough persisting from Tuesday, treated with honey and vinegar. Bowels regular. Sleep interrupted twice by Grimshaw's coughing through wall. Energy moderate. Appetite normal. Bath taken at Victoria, 3 Dental twinge in lower left molar, increasing. Must consider extraction before winter sets in proper. This health journal was his own innovation, inspired by reading about Florence Nightingale's statistical work on mortality causes. By tracking his own health patterns, he could identify problems early and seek treatment before they became serious. He had noticed, for instance, that his joint pains worsened in damp weather and could prepare preventive measures accordingly. Sunday arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Manchester morning where the sky seemed to press down upon the city like a wet wool blanket. Thomas woke to the unusual sound of relative quiet, no mill whistles, no clatter of clogs on cobblestones, just the distant pealing of church bells calling the faithful to morning service. The Sabbath was zealously guarded in industrial Manchester, enforced by law and social convention alike. The mills stood silent, their great chimneys emitting only thin wisps of smoke from banked boiler fires. Public houses remained firmly shut until evening, and even the omnibuses ran on reduced schedules. It was a day for rest, reflection, and, for those so inclined, religious observance. Thomas dressed in his best suit, the one reserved for Sundays and special occasions. The fabric was good wool, purchased 7 years ago from a deceased member's widow who needed the money for burial expenses. It had been carefully altered to fit and maintained with religious devotion, brushed weekly, pressed with a hot iron and damp cloth, minor repairs executed with invisible stitches. Breakfast on Sunday was special, an egg, purchased yesterday from a farmer's wife at the market, boiled for exactly 4 minutes to achieve the perfect consistency. He ate it with toasted bread and even allowed himself a scraping of butter, a luxury that transformed the simple meal into something approaching feast. His morning would be spent at the Ancoats dispensary, where he volunteered as an assistant to the visiting physicians who provided free medical consultations to the poor. It was work that combined his sense of Christian duty with practical education in medical matters that benefited his role with the society. The dispensary occupied a converted warehouse on every street, its red brick facade bearing a simple painted sign, "Free medical aid for the deserving poor." Inside, the waiting room was already filling with patients despite the early hour. Families sat on wooden benches, children fidgeting while parents tried to maintain order. The air smelled of carbolic, poverty, and sickness, a combination that had become familiar to Thomas over his 3 years of voluntary service. Dr. Robertson, the senior physician who donated his Sunday mornings to the dispensary, greeted Thomas warmly. "Ah, Whitworth, good to see you. We've a full clinic today. This damp weather always brings out the bronchial cases." Thomas's duties were varied, maintaining the patient register, preparing simple medicines under supervision, translating medical instructions into language the patients could understand, and sometimes simply offering a sympathetic ear to those whose ailments were as much social as physical. The first patient was Mrs. O'Brien, an Irish widow with 5 children, complaining of persistent headaches and weakness. Dr. Robertson examined her quickly but thoroughly, checking her eyes for signs of anemia, palpating her neck for enlarged glands, listening to her chest with his stethoscope. Chronic anemia, exacerbated by poor diet, he diagnosed quietly to Thomas while Mrs. O'Brien dressed behind a screen. "She needs iron tonic and beef tea, but I suspect she can afford neither." This was the perpetual dilemma of the dispensary, diagnosing conditions that required treatments beyond the patient's means. Thomas prepared a bottle of iron mixture from the dispensary's supplies, carefully labeling it with dosage instructions. He also discreetly slipped Mrs. O'Brien a card for the Society's soup kitchen, which operated 3 evenings a week. The morning progressed with a parade of industrial ailments: mill fever, phthisis, white lead poisoning from the paint works, various infections, and injuries. A young boy presented with rickets, his legs bowed like parentheses, his chest deformed into what the medical texts called pigeon breast. Dr. Robertson prescribed cod liver oil and exposure to sunlight, challenging prescriptions for a child who lived in a cellar and whose family couldn't afford lamp oil, let alone medicinal supplements. One case particularly impressed itself upon Thomas's memory. A paper mill worker named Harrison, not from Millbrook but from a smaller works without a benefit society, arrived with his wife, both of them showing signs of severe lead poisoning. Their gums showed the characteristic blue line, their hands trembled with what doctors called painter's palsy, and Harrison complained of severe abdominal pain. "You work with white lead in the coating room?" Dr. Robertson asked, though the symptoms made the answer obvious. "Aye, sir." These 2 years passed. "The pay's good, extra 4 pence a day for dangerous work, but lately..." Harrison trailed off, his trembling hand gesturing at his condition. Dr. Robertson's face darkened. He had strong opinions about industrial poisoning, which he expressed freely in medical journals and public lectures, though these had made him unpopular with certain mill owners. "You must leave that work immediately," he told Harrison. "The lead is slowly poisoning your entire system. Continue, and you'll be dead within a year." "But sir, the wages..." "Better to live poor than die rich," the doctor said firmly. He prescribed chelating treatments, sulfur preparations that might bind with the lead and help eliminate it, but Thomas could see in his eyes that he held little hope for significant recovery. After Harrison left, Dr. Robertson turned to Thomas. "This is murder by installments," he said bitterly. "The owners know the dangers of lead, but they offer a few extra pence and desperate men queue up to poison themselves." The dispensary closed at 1 o'clock, having seen 47 patients. Thomas helped clean and organize the supplies, noting what medicines were running low. The dispensary survived on charitable donations, and supplies were always precarious. He made a mental note to propose that the society make a small annual contribution, enlighten self-interest, as healthy workers met fewer benefit claims. Sunday afternoon found Thomas walking through Phillips Park, one of the few green spaces accessible to the working classes of Manchester. The park, donated to the city by the Phillips family, provided 47 acres of grass, trees, and relatively clean air, a luxury in a city where most workers saw greenery only in the weeds that grew between cobblestones. The park was busy despite the drizzle. Families spread blankets on the damp grass, children rolled hoops along the paths, young couples walked arm in arm under the watchful eyes of chaperones. The brass band of the Manchester Regiment played in the bandstand, their military marches and popular melodies drifting across the grounds. Thomas observed the scene with his usual analytical eye, noting the health implications of this weekly ritual. The children playing in the fresh air would sleep better tonight, their lungs cleared of the week's accumulation of soot and fumes. The adults walking the paths were exercising muscles cramped from repetitive industrial work. Even the simple act of seeing beyond the confines of narrow streets and factory walls had restorative power. He encountered several society members enjoying the park with their families. William Hartley, recovered from his scalding injury, walked slowly with his wife and 3 children. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 4, ran ahead chasing pigeons, her laughter bright as silver bells. "Mr. Whitworth," Hartley called out. "Enjoying the Lord's Day?" They walked together for a while, discussing Hartley's recovery and return to work. He had been assigned to lighter duties temporarily, tending to rag sorting rather than the dangerous sizing vats, a accommodation that spoke well of Mr. Millbrook's management. "The wife's been after me to leave the mill work entirely," Hartley confided. "Her brother's got a position for me at the goods yard, railway work, steadier and safer. But I've been at Millbrook since I was 12. It's hard to imagine leaving." This was a common dilemma. Mill work, for all its dangers, provided community and identity. The railway might pay better and be safer, but it meant starting over, losing seniority, leaving the familiar for the unknown. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the pond. A child had fallen in, not deep, but enough to soak him through. His mother pulled him out, slapping him for carelessness while simultaneously checking for injury. The child wailed, more from shock and cold than harm. Thomas watched as several women gathered around, offering advice and assistance. One produced a dry shawl to wrap the shivering child. Another suggested rubbing his limbs to restore circulation. A third warned against the dangers of chill and recommended a hot mustard bath as soon as they reached home. This community response to crisis, Thomas reflected, was one of the working class's greatest strengths. Without servants or wealth to cushion life's blows, they had developed networks of mutual support that responded instinctively to need. The society was simply a formalization of this ancient impulse, adding structure and sustainability to what had always existed informally. As afternoon faded toward evening, Thomas made his way to the Temperance Hall on Chester Road, where the society held its monthly educational lecture. Tonight's speaker was Mr. Andrews, a sanitary inspector from the corporation, speaking on domestic hygiene and the prevention of disease. The hall was well attended. Education was one of the few acceptable Sunday evening activities, and the lectures were free to society members and their families. Women sat on one side, men on the other, with children in the front rows where they could be watched and shushed as necessary. Mr. Andrews was a compelling speaker who understood his audience. He didn't talk down to them or use incomprehensible medical terminology, but rather explained complex concepts in practical terms. "Disease is not caused by bad air or moral failing," he began, challenging traditional beliefs directly. "It's caused by tiny creatures, so small you cannot see them without a microscope, that spread from person to person through dirt and contamination." He demonstrated proper hand-washing technique using a basin and soap, explaining how the mechanical action of rubbing, combined with the chemical properties of soap, removed these invisible threats. He showed how to prepare a proper disinfectant solution using carbolic acid, warning against making it too strong, it'll burn your skin, or too weak, might as well use plain water. The audience listened intently, some taking notes in penny notebooks. When Andrews opened the floor for questions, hands shot up immediately. "Is it true that keeping windows open prevents consumption?" asked one woman. "Fresh air is beneficial," Andrews replied carefully, "but it won't cure tuberculosis once established. However, good ventilation does reduce the concentration of infectious particles in the air, making transmission less likely." "What about these new water closets?" "My mother says they're unhealthy, keeping all that waste in the house." Andrews smiled. "Properly installed and maintained water closets are far more hygienic than earth closets or middens. The key is the water seal in the trap, which prevents sewer gases from entering the home." As darkness fell and the Sabbath drew to a close, Thomas returned to his lodgings for his weekly health maintenance rituals. Sunday evening was when he performed those personal care tasks that required time and privacy, luxuries in short supply during the working week. He began by heating water on his small fire, filling his basin for a thorough wash. Without the public bath's abundant hot water, he had to be economical, but he had developed an efficient system. First, he washed his hair with soft soap, working up a lather despite the hard Manchester water that resisted suds. The gray water that resulted, full of the week's accumulated soot and oil, was disposed of down the drain in the corridor. Next came the trimming of his nails, using a small penknife kept sharp for the purpose. Long nails were not just unsightly but dangerous in mill work, where they could catch in machinery. He cleaned beneath each nail with a wooden splinter, removing the ink stains and dirt that accumulated despite his daily washing. His feet received special attention. Mill workers' feet suffered constantly, from standing on hard floors, from the heat and humidity, from cheap boots that rarely fit properly. Thomas soaked his feet in warm water with a handful of salt, a remedy his mother had taught him for reducing swelling and toughening skin. He examined them carefully for signs of infection or injury, knowing that an untreated foot problem could mean weeks off work. The dental twinge he had noted in his journal had worsened throughout the day. He examined his teeth in the small mirror, using a candle for better light. The lower left molar showed a dark spot, decay that would only worsen. He would need to visit Morrison soon, before it became unbearable. For tonight, he packed the cavity with a small piece of cotton soaked in oil of cloves, a temporary remedy that numbed the pain. As he prepared for bed, Thomas reviewed his memorandum book, planning the week ahead. Monday, collect contributions from the night shift workers who couldn't attend the regular meeting. Tuesday, visit the 3 members currently on sick benefit to verify their conditions. Wednesday, meet with Morrison's Pharmacy about the bulk medicine purchase. Thursday, compile the monthly report for the factory inspector on workplace accidents. Friday, prepare for the committee meeting with Mr. Millbrook about ventilation. Each task required different skills: accounting, investigation, negotiation, documentation. The role of Benefit Society treasurer, Thomas had come to understand, was as complex as any professional position, requiring a combination of financial acumen, medical knowledge, social skills, and moral authority. Yet it was unpaid work, done in addition to his regular mill duties, motivated solely by the principle of mutual aid. He pulled out his health journal to make the day's entry. November 17th, 1873. Sunday. Weather damp and cold. Attended dispensary, exposed to various contagions, performed carbolic wash after. Walk in park, approximately 2 miles, breathing improved. Dental pain increasing, oil of cloves applied. Bowels irregular, likely result of egg at breakfast, unaccustomed richness. Energy good despite late meeting yesterday. Sleep anticipated to be disrupted by tooth pain. Before extinguishing his candle, Thomas allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The society had helped 7 families this week avoid destitution. The new dental fund, controversial as it was, would prevent suffering. The proposed ventilation improvements might save lives. It was slow, incremental progress, but progress nonetheless. Monday arrived with a vengeance, bringing sleet that rattled against the windows like handful of tiny stones. Thomas woke to find his water not just cold but frozen solid, requiring him to break the ice with the handle of his razor before he could perform even the most basic washing. The fire, banked too carefully the night before to save coal, had died completely, leaving the room arctic. His tooth had kept him awake much of the night, throbbing in time with his heartbeat. The oil of cloves had provided temporary relief, but its effects wore off within hours. He considered taking laudanum. He had a small bottle for emergencies, but decided against it. The drug would dull his mind as well as his pain, and he needed his wits about him for the day's work. Breakfast was hasty and minimal, dry bread that hurt to chew and tea drunk lukewarm to avoid aggravating his tooth. He wrapped himself in layers: shirt, waistcoat, jacket, overcoat, muffler, each one worn but clean, presenting the respectable facade that his position required despite his physical discomfort. The walk to Millbrook Paper Works was treacherous, the cobblestones glazed with ice that sent more than one early pedestrian sliding. Thomas walked carefully, mindful that a broken bone would mean weeks without wages and a drain on the very society funds he administered. At the mill, he found chaos. The boilers, struggling against the cold, had failed to build adequate steam pressure. The machines were running at half speed, and tempers were running hot as workers stood idle, knowing their piece rates would suffer. Mr. Carmichael, the works manager, stalked through the buildings like a man possessed, shouting orders that seemed to make little difference to the mechanical difficulties. In this disruption, Thomas saw opportunity. He approached Carmichael during a brief moment of calm. "Mr. Carmichael, sir, about that ventilation matter the society raised." "Not now, Whitworth," the manager snapped, then paused, reconsidering. "Actually, yes. Your society members, if they want improvements, they need to maintain production. This standing about won't help anyone's case." Thomas understood the implicit bargain. He spent the next hour moving through the mill, using his influence to encourage patience and continued effort despite the difficulties. "The machines will be at full speed soon," he assured the workers. "Best to be ready when they are. And remember, management's watching how we handle adversity." By 10 o'clock, the boilers had reached operational pressure and production resumed. Thomas returned to his office to find a queue of workers waiting. Monday was collection day for many who preferred to pay their society contributions directly rather than have them deducted from wages. Each transaction was carefully recorded: name, member number, amount paid, running balance. Some paid their standard 4 pence. Others, behind in their contributions due to illness or reduced work, paid what they could, sometimes just a penny or two. Thomas never showed judgment, understanding that even the smallest payment represented sacrifice and commitment to the principle of mutual aid. Between collections, he wrote letters to other societies, part of the informal network that shared information about treatments, doctors, and potential frauds. From the Salford Engineers Society came news of a new treatment for consumption involving inhalation of creosote vapors. The Oldham cotton spinners reported success with a scheme providing spectacles to workers whose eyesight was failing, a common problem among those who worked with fine detail in poor light. At midday, his tooth pain having become unbearable, Thomas made a decision. He would visit Morrison's dental rooms during the dinner break. The extraction would cost 1 shilling and 6 pence, a day's wages for many workers, but the pain was affecting his ability to function. Morrison's was busy as always, the waiting room filled with sufferers holding swollen jaws and trying to appear stoic. Thomas signed the register and took his numbered ticket, 14. He would be waiting at least an hour, time he could ill afford, but had no choice. The waiting room was a study in working-class dental misery. A young woman rocked a crying infant whose teething had brought fever. An elderly man sat perfectly still, as if movement might trigger the lightning bolts of pain from his abscessed tooth. A boy of perhaps 12, brought by his mother, tried to appear brave despite tears streaming down his face. When Thomas's number was finally called, he entered the surgery with a mixture of relief and dread. Morrison, a thin man with precise movements and permanently stained fingers from handling various dental preparations, examined his mouth with a small mirror and metal probe. Lower left molar, extensive decay reaching the nerve, he diagnosed briskly. Extraction is the only option. Do you want the cocaine preparation for numbing? It's 6 pence extra. Thomas considered. The pain of extraction was brief but intense. The cocaine was a luxury he could afford, but it seemed indulgent. "I'll manage without," he said, gripping the arms of the dental chair. Morrison nodded approvingly. He saw this stoic attitude daily. He selected a pair of lower molar forceps from his instrument tray, their steel jaws designed specifically for gripping the multi-rooted teeth. "Open wide, hold absolutely still, and it will be over quickly." What followed was 30 seconds of exquisite agony as Morrison gripped the tooth, twisted to break the ligaments holding it in place, and pulled with considerable force. Thomas felt the roots tear free from his jaw with a sensation like ripping fabric. Blood immediately filled his mouth, warm and metallic. Morrison packed the socket with lint soaked in tincture of myrrh to stem the bleeding and gave brief aftercare instructions. Rinse with salt water every 2 hours. No solid food today. If bleeding continues beyond tonight, return immediately. That'll be 1 shilling and 6 pence. Thomas paid, accepted a small envelope of powdered alum to help with clotting, and left the surgery feeling simultaneously worse and better. The extraction pain was severe but different from the chronic ache, sharper but cleaner, with the promise of eventual relief. Walking back to the mill with a handkerchief pressed to his mouth, he reflected on the democracy of dental pain. Rich and poor alike suffered from tooth decay, though the wealthy could afford preventive care and pain relief that remained beyond working-class means. He had read that Queen Victoria herself used chloroform for her dental procedures, a luxury as distant from Morrison's quick extractions as Buckingham Palace from a Manchester tenement. The afternoon at the mill passed in a haze of throbbing pain and dutiful work. Thomas continued his ledger entries, though his handwriting, usually precise as engraving, wavered occasionally when sharp pangs shot through his jaw. The blood had mostly stopped, though he still tasted iron and myrrh. At 3 o'clock, he was summoned to Mr. Millbrook's office, an unexpected honor that suggested the owner had heard about the morning's intervention with the workers. Millbrook's private domain occupied the top floor of the administrative building, reached by a staircase carpeted in Turkish runners that muffled footsteps. The office itself was a testament to industrial success. Mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, a globe showing the empire's reach in commanding red. Mr. Josiah Millbrook was 63, with white whiskers and the confident bearing of a man who had built his fortune through personal effort. He had started as a mill hand himself 40 years ago, a fact he never let his workers forget, though Thomas suspected the similarities between then and now were fewer than the owner imagined. "Whitworth," Millbrook said, gesturing to a chair. Carmichael tells me you were helpful this morning during our mechanical difficulties. Just doing my part, sir, Thomas replied carefully, his words slightly slurred from the swollen extraction site. Been to the tooth puller, have you? Millbrook observed, noting the swelling. Painful business. I had 3 pulled last month, though I had the gas, of course. Marvelous invention, nitrous oxide. Like floating on clouds while they work. The casual mention of laughing gas, which cost an additional 5 shillings at the Better Dental Surgeries, highlighted the gulf between owner and workers. Thomas's extraction had been endured with only willpower as anesthetic. Now then, Millbrook continued, this ventilation business your society has raised. Carmichael is resistant, talks about costs and structural complications. But I've been reading the factory inspectors' reports. Other mills have implemented extraction systems successfully. What would satisfy your members? Thomas, fighting through his discomfort, presented the case he had prepared. Simple extraction fans in the rag cutting and bleaching rooms would make the greatest difference, sir. The Britannia Mill installed them last year. Their sick days dropped by 30% in those departments. 30%? Millbrook's eyes sharpened with interest. Sick workers meant lost production and recruitment costs for replacements. Do you have documentation? I can obtain it, sir. Their Benefit Society secretary is a correspondent of mine. Do so. If the numbers support it, we'll trial 1 fan in the rag room. If it proves effective, we'll consider expansion. This was more progress than Thomas had dared hope for. He thanked Millbrook and prepared to leave, but the owner wasn't finished. Your society does good work, Whitworth. Keeps the men stable, reduces desperation. I'm considering making a donation, anonymous, of course. Can't have workers thinking I'm soft. But £100 might help your medical fund considerably. Thomas nearly gasped. £100 was more than the society collected in contributions in 2 months. It would fund medicine purchases, additional doctor visits, perhaps even preventive health measures they had only dreamed of. That would be extraordinarily generous, sir, he managed. Enlightened self-interest, Millbrook replied, a phrase Thomas had heard before from reformist manufacturers. Healthy workers are productive workers. I'll have my banker arrange it. Walking back to his office, Thomas's mind raced despite his physical discomfort. With Millbrook's donation, they could implement programs that had seemed impossible. Perhaps even hire a visiting nurse to check on members' families, catching illness early when treatment was most effective. The rest of the afternoon was spent in correspondence with other societies about the ventilation systems. The Britannia Mills secretary, James Howarth, responded promptly with detailed statistics and even technical drawings of their fan installation. The initial cost was substantial, £70 per fan including installation, but the reduction in sick days had paid for it within 18 months. As evening approached, Thomas prepared for his home visits to members on sick benefit. Despite his own pain, this duty couldn't be postponed. Trust required verification, and the Society's rules were clear about regular inspections. His first visit was to Peter Ashworth, a young bleacher suffering from what Dr. Hartwell had diagnosed as chlorine poisoning. The fumes in the bleaching house had gradually destroyed his lung capacity until climbing stairs left him gasping like a landed fish. The Ashworth family lived in a cellar dwelling on Bengal Street, accessed by worn stone steps that descended below street level. Thomas had to duck to enter the low doorway, immediately hit by the damp that permeated everything. Cellar dwellings were the cheapest accommodation available, but they came with severe health costs. The walls wept with condensation, black mold grew in corners, and the air never fully cleared of the miasma of too many people in too small a space. Peter lay on a straw mattress near the single window, positioned to catch whatever light filtered down from street level. His breathing was audible from across the room, a horrible wheezing that spoke of permanently damaged airways. His wife, Margaret, heavily pregnant with their third child, looked exhausted from caring for him while managing 2 young children. "How are you managing, Peter?" Thomas asked gently, though the answer was obvious. "Each day's a struggle, Mr. Whitworth," Peter wheezed. "Doctor says the lungs might improve if I could get to the seaside, but..." He gestured helplessly at their surroundings. Thomas made notes about the convalescent fund. With Millbrook's donation, perhaps they could send more members for seaside recovery. He also noted that Margaret looked anemic, pale, breathless, with the telltale blue tinge to her fingernails. The pregnancy was draining her already depleted reserves. "Mrs. Ashworth, are you taking the iron tonic Dr. Hartwell prescribed?" She shook her head. "We can't afford it, not with Peter unable to work." Thomas made another note. The bulk medicine purchase needed to happen soon. He quietly resolved to advance them credit against Peter's future benefits, strictly against the rules, but humanity sometimes required flexibility. The evening had turned bitter cold by the time Thomas completed his visits. His jaw throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel swelling distorting the left side of his face. The extraction site had started bleeding again, probably from talking during the home visits. He stopped at Morrison's Pharmacy on Market Street, needing alum powder and perhaps something stronger for the pain. The pharmacy was a wonder of Victorian commerce, its window displaying colored bottles that glowed like gems in the gaslight. Inside, floor-to-ceiling shelves held hundreds of medicines, preparations, and compounds, each promising relief from humanity's various ailments. Mr. Morrison Sr., the pharmacist rather than his tooth-pulling son, presided over this temple of healing. He looked at Thomas's swollen face with professional interest. "Extraction today? Let me prepare something proper for you. The alum's good for clotting, but you need laudanum for the pain and perhaps some cocaine solution as a local application." As Morrison worked, measuring and mixing with practiced precision, Thomas observed the other customers. A well-dressed woman purchased Godfrey's cordial, that notorious infant soother that contained enough opium to quiet the most fractious child, permanently, if overdosed. A laborer bought a penny's worth of Gradual, the cheapest laudanum mixed with alcohol that provided temporary escape from physical and existential pain. "Here," Morrison said, handing Thomas a small bottle. "Laudanum, 15 drops in water for pain. Don't exceed 20 drops or you'll be seeing angels. And this," he produced another bottle, "is cocaine solution. Soak a small cotton wad and pack it against the extraction site. Marvelous for dental pain." The cost, 2 shillings and threepence, was considerable, but Thomas paid without complaint. Pain had its own economy, and relief was worth any price when suffering became unbearable. Walking home, he passed the night market where vendors sold hot food to workers ending or beginning their shifts. The smell of fried fish and potatoes made his stomach growl, but his mouth couldn't handle solid food. He bought a cup of beef tea instead, the hot liquid both nourishment and comfort. In his room, Thomas carefully followed Morrison's instructions. The laudanum, bitter and medicinal, spread warmth through his body and gradually dulled the sharp edges of pain. The cocaine solution, applied directly to the extraction site, provided blessed numbness. For the first time since morning, he could think clearly. He used this clarity to work on his proposal for the bulk medicine purchase. With Millbrook's promised donation, they could establish a proper dispensary for society members. He listed the essential medicines: laudanum for pain, carbolic acid for antisepsis, iron tonic for anemia, cod liver oil for consumption, ipecacuanha for respiratory ailments, mercury compounds for syphilis, a delicate matter, but necessary, quinine for fever, digitalis for heart conditions, various salves and ointments for industrial injuries. The list grew as he considered the myriad ways industrial workers suffered. Burns from steam and chemicals, cuts from machinery, respiratory diseases from dust and fumes, skin conditions from handling irritants, joint problems from repetitive motion, each required specific treatments that most workers couldn't afford. A knock at his door interrupted his planning. Mrs. Grimshaw stood in the hallway, looking concerned. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Whitworth, but my Johnny's taken terrible sick. Fever and a rash. I'm worried it might be scarlet fever." Thomas's blood ran cold. Scarlet fever was a killer, especially in the crowded tenements where it spread like wildfire. If Johnny had it, the entire lodging house was at risk. "Have you isolated him?" Thomas asked. "Put him in the back room, away from the others." "But Mr. Whitworth, I can't afford the doctor." Thomas didn't hesitate. "I'll fetch Dr. Hartwell. Keep Johnny isolated, and start carbolic fumigation if you have any. Burn sulfur candles if you don't." He dressed quickly and hurried through the dark streets to Dr. Hartwell's residence, a modest house that served as both home and surgery. The doctor answered the door himself, still dressed despite the late hour. Medical men rarely fully retired for the night. "Possible scarlet fever at my lodging house," Thomas explained quickly. Dr. Hartwell grabbed his bag immediately. "How many potentially exposed?" 8 families, about 30 people total." They walked rapidly through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing off the building walls. The doctor explained his approach as they went. "If it's scarlet fever, we need immediate isolation and disinfection. Every surface the boy touched must be cleaned with carbolic solution. All bedding and clothing boiled or burned. The other residents need to be examined for early symptoms." At the lodging house, Dr. Hartwell examined Johnny with careful efficiency. The boy was delirious with fever, his throat inflamed, the characteristic strawberry tongue and sandpaper-like rash confirming the diagnosis. "Scarlet fever, without question," the doctor announced grimly. "The boy needs hospital isolation, but the fever hospital is full. We'll have to manage here." What followed was a long night of medical crisis management. Thomas helped Dr. Hartwell examine every resident, looking for early signs of infection. They prepared carbolic solutions and supervised the disinfection of common areas. Mrs. Grimshaw was instructed in nursing procedures, how to handle contaminated items, how to prepare the prescribed medicines, how to recognize danger signs. By 3 in the morning, initial containment measures were in place. The doctor prescribed treatment for Johnny, salicylate for fever, gargles for the throat, careful nutrition if he could swallow. The prognosis was guarded. Scarlet fever killed 1 in 5 even with good care. Thomas didn't sleep that night. Between his throbbing jaw, the laudanum making him lightheaded, and worry about the scarlet fever outbreak, he sat at his small table watching the sky lighten toward dawn. He used the time to write in his journal, documenting the health crisis for the Society's records and his own understanding. November 19, 1873. Scarlet fever confirmed at 27, Bengal Street. 1 case isolated, 30 residents potentially exposed. Carbolic disinfection implemented per Dr. Hartwell's protocols. Notable, families with better nutrition and ventilation showed stronger resistance to infection. Must investigate correlation between living conditions and disease susceptibility. As the church bells tolled 6, he prepared for another day at the mill. His jaw had improved, the swelling reduced, the pain manageable without laudanum. He performed his morning ablutions with extra care, using hot water and strong soap, mindful of the infection risk he'd been exposed to. At Millbrook Paper Works, news of the scarlet fever had already spread. Workers gave him a wide berth, fear of contagion overcoming social courtesy. Thomas didn't blame them. Infectious disease was the specter that haunted every working-class family. He went directly to his office and posted a notice. Any society member experiencing fever, sore throat, or rash should report immediately for medical examination. Early treatment saves lives. The Society will cover all consultation costs for suspected scarlet fever cases. This was beyond his authority. The committee hadn't approved such expenditure, but Thomas knew delay could mean death. He would justify it later, using Millbrook's promised donation if necessary. The morning brought a stream of worried parents to his office. Every childhood sniffle suddenly seemed sinister, every minor rash potentially fatal. Thomas patiently recorded each concern, referring serious cases to Dr. Hartwell and reassuring others that their children showed no signs of scarlet fever. By midday, 3 more cases had been identified, all children from the same court where Johnny lived. Dr. Hartwell, working without rest, had established a makeshift isolation ward in an empty warehouse, convincing the owner that preventing an epidemic served everyone's interests. The Society's committee convened an emergency meeting during the dinner break. President Thornton, his face grave, called for immediate action. Brothers, we face a crisis that threatens not just our members but the entire district. What resources can we deploy? Thomas presented his recommendations: fund medical care for all suspected cases, provide nutrition supplements for recovering patients, establish a temporary nursing fund to hire qualified help, and most controversially, pay sick benefits to healthy workers who isolated themselves after exposure. We'd be bankrupt in a week, protested the committee's secretary. We'd be dead in a month if this spreads unchecked, Thomas countered. And Mr. Millbrook has promised a substantial donation that would cover these emergency measures. After heated debate, the committee approved the emergency measures, contingent on Millbrook's donation being confirmed. Thomas was authorized to implement immediate containment protocols. The afternoon was spent in frantic activity. Thomas negotiated with suppliers for medical provisions, arranged for the distribution of carbolic acid to affected households, and coordinated with other benefit societies to share information and resources. The Manchester Operative Cotton Spinners Association, the largest and wealthiest society, offered a loan if needed, solidarity in the face of common threat. By evening, a system was in place. Suspected cases would be examined free of charge, confirmed cases isolated and treated, exposed individuals monitored daily. The society would provide medicines, disinfectants, and nutritional supplements. It was expensive, potentially ruinous, but the alternative, unchecked epidemic, was unthinkable. 3 weeks passed in a blur of medical crisis and gradual recovery. The scarlet fever outbreak, contained through swift action and considerable expense, claimed 4 lives, tragic but far fewer than the dozens or hundreds an unchecked epidemic might have taken. Johnny Grimshaw survived, though weakened and requiring months of convalescence. Thomas stood in his office at Millbrook Paper Works, reviewing the financial aftermath. The emergency had cost the society £37, more than 3 months' normal expenditure. But Millbrook's donation had materialized as promised, delivered discreetly through his banker, saving the society from insolvency. More importantly, the crisis had demonstrated the society's value beyond dispute. Membership applications had flooded in from previously skeptical workers who had witnessed the organization's response. The committee had voted to establish a permanent epidemic fund, a reserve specifically for disease outbreaks. His own health had improved markedly. The extraction site had healed cleanly, the chronic pain that had plagued him for months replaced by blessed relief. He had even gained weight, able to eat properly for the first time in memory. His journal recorded the transformation. December 10, 1873. General health much improved. Weight increased by half a stone. Sleep uninterrupted. Energy levels highest in years. Remarkable how single source of chronic pain can affect entire constitution. A knock at his door interrupted his reflection. Albert Henshaw entered, bearing good news. Mr. Whitworth, the ventilation fan's been installed in the rag room. Mr. Millbrook approved it yesterday, and the engineers worked through the night. Would you like to see it? They walked together to the rag cutting room, where a crowd of workers had gathered to witness this marvel of industrial progress. The fan, mounted high on the wall, was a magnificent piece of engineering, 6 feet in diameter, its blades powered by a belt drive from the main shaft. When the engineer threw the lever, it roared to life, creating a powerful draft that drew the dusty air up and out through a newly installed vent. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The perpetual haze that had characterized the rag room began to clear. Workers could see across the space clearly for the first time in memory. The air, while still far from pure, was noticeably easier to breathe. Old Patterson, the veteran worker with ruined lungs, stood watching with tears in his eyes. 40 years too late for me, he said quietly, but my grandson starts here next month. Maybe he'll still have working lungs when he's my age. This was progress, Thomas thought, slow, hard-won, incremental, but real. The society had achieved something tangible that would improve lives for generations. The ventilation fan was more than machinery, it was proof that organized workers could affect change. That evening, the society held its monthly general meeting. The hall was packed beyond capacity, with members standing along the walls and crowding the doorway. The scarlet fever crisis had awakened many to the importance of collective action. President Thornton called the meeting to order with unusual emotion in his voice. "Brothers, we have weathered a storm that might have destroyed us. Instead, we have emerged stronger, our purpose validated, our solidarity proven." Thomas presented his treasurer's report, detailing the extraordinary expenses and Millbrook's donation. The members listened in amazed silence as he described the full scope of their emergency response. "We provided medical care to 43 individuals, distributed over 200 bottles of disinfectant, supplied medicines worth £15, and prevented an epidemic that could have paralyzed the entire district. This was only possible because we stood together." The applause was thunderous, working men's hands hardened by labor creating a sound like thunder. Thomas felt a flush of pride, not personal aggrandizement, but satisfaction in collective achievement. Dr. Hartwell, invited to address the meeting, provided medical perspective on their accomplishment. "Gentlemen, what you achieved was remarkable. In the cholera outbreak of 1849, this district lost 800 souls. In the typhoid epidemic of 1861, 500 died. This scarlet fever outbreak, which had all the makings of similar disaster, claimed just 4 lives. The difference? Organization, rapid response, and the resources your society provided." He continued with recommendations for preventing future outbreaks, regular health inspections, improved sanitation in workers' housing, nutritional support for vulnerable families, and most ambitiously, the establishment of a workers' health clinic staffed by qualified medical professionals. "Disease thrives on poverty, overcrowding, and ignorance," the doctor concluded. "Your society attacks all 3. Continue this work, and you'll save more lives than any hospital." 6 months later, on a warm June evening in 1874, Thomas Whitworth walked through the streets of Manchester with a sense of measured satisfaction. The city hadn't transformed, the chimneys still belched smoke, the tenements still crowded too many into too little space, the mills still demanded their toll in sweat and sometimes blood. But changes, subtle yet significant, were visible to those who knew where to look. The ventilation system at Millbrook Paper Works had been expanded to 3 departments. Sick days had decreased by 40%. Other mills, seeing the economic benefits, were following suit. The rag cutters no longer coughed black phlegm. The bleachers could work full shifts without collapsing. The society's membership had swollen to 500, making it one of the largest in Manchester. The bulk medicine scheme was fully operational, providing members with essential treatments at half the market rate. A trained nurse, Mrs. Henderson, had been employed part-time to visit sick members and provide basic care. Most remarkably, the society had opened a small clinic in a rented room on every street. It operated just 3 evenings a week, staffed by Dr. Hartwell and 2 assistants, but it provided free consultations and basic treatments to members and their families. The waiting room was always full, but the care was competent and compassionate. Thomas entered the clinic to find Mrs. Ashworth, the bleacher's wife he'd visited months ago, waiting with her new baby, a healthy girl who had survived birth and the dangerous first months that claimed so many infants. "Mr. Whitworth," she exclaimed. "Look, she's thriving. The iron tonic you arranged, the extra nutrition during my lying in, it made all the difference. The baby, plump and alert, represented hope incarnate. She would grow up in an industrial city, true, but one where organizations like the Society provided a safety net, where workers understood that collective action could improve their lot, where the principles of mutual aid offered an alternative to isolated suffering. Thomas continued to his office at the mill, where his evening would be spent on familiar tasks, updating ledgers, processing claims, corresponding with other societies. It was unglamorous work, the small incremental labor of social progress. But he had learned that this was how change happened, not through revolution but through revolution's quiet cousin, organization. His journal entry that night was brief but content. June 15, 1874. Health excellent. Society thriving, 523 members, 12 pounds in reserve after all expenses. 3 lives saved this week through early medical intervention. Ventilation system proving successful, possible expansion to all departments under consideration. Small victories accumulate into larger transformation. The work continues. Through his window, Thomas could see the mill workers heading home as the evening shift ended. They walked with the tired dignity of those who had labored honestly for their bread. Many wore the small brass pin of society membership, a symbol not just of insurance against disaster but of belonging to something larger than individual struggle. The industrial age would continue to exact its price in human terms. The machines would still maim, the chemicals would still poison, the diseases would still spread through crowded quarters. But the Benefit Society, and hundreds like it across industrial Britain, had proven that workers could create their own institutions of protection and progress. Could you survive as a Benefit Society treasurer in industrial Manchester? Thomas Whitworth had not merely survived but had helped others do the same. Through careful administration, patient negotiation, and unwavering commitment to mutual aid, he had played his part in the great drama of industrial civilization, not as a captain of industry or a political revolutionary, but as a careful guardian of working-class welfare. The bells of St. Anne's chimed 10 o'clock as Thomas prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, claims to process, members to visit, negotiations to conduct. But tonight, he could rest with the satisfaction of duty fulfilled and lives improved. In the grand sweep of history, his contribution might seem small. But to the families who had food during sickness, medicine during illness, and dignity in death, Thomas Whitworth, in the Millbrook Paper Workers Mutual Aid and Benefit Society had made all the difference in the world. The city settled into its nighttime rhythms, the clatter of night shift workers heading to the mills, the distant whistle of a freight train, the occasional cry of a night watchman. Manchester slept, and dreamed, and prepared for another day of industrial life, made slightly more bearable by the quiet work of mutual aid. And in his narrow bed, in his modest room, Thomas Whitworth slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who had found his purpose and fulfilled it well. The industrial city thundered on around him, but within its iron heart beat something unexpectedly gentle, the promise that workers could care for one another, that suffering could be shared and thereby lessened, that even in the age of machines, humanity could prevail. As you drift off to sleep, let the rhythms of industrial Manchester fade into the background of your dreams. The steady pulse of machinery becomes your heartbeat slowing toward rest. The hiss of steam transforms into gentle breathing. The solidarity of workers becomes the comfort of knowing you are not alone. Sleep well, and dream of a world where mutual aid and human kindness prevail against all odds.